Nightcast. Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth brings you the current news from the world today and how it relates to Bible prophecy. Understanding the end-time events leading to the peaceful world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to this July 3rd, 2014 edition of Nightcast. An uncle of one of 3 Israeli teenagers who were kidnapped and killed in the West Bank has called for restraint to be shown on both sides. As you know, a Palestinian teenager was also kidnapped and killed. We don't know by whom yet, but it's believed, everybody believes, that it was in revenge. Yishy Frankie was speaking as a delay was announced in the funeral of a young Palestinian abducted and killed in Jerusalem. His murder on yesterday, raised tensions amid claims it was in revenge for the killing of 3 Israeli youths whose funerals took place 2 days ago on Tuesday. This is our opening story, dear friends.
It's tragic beyond belief. But, we need to continue with our lives. So we need to rationalize the pain. We very much want to see the evil people who did this, come to justice. And we must go on and return to normal life and to, a life of creating and doing and living and being happy.
You're hearing the voice of Yishy Frankel, the uncle of Naftali Frankel, who told BBC Radio 5 Live his nephew's death was tragic beyond belief, but the path of retaliation was not the answer. He goes on in this BBC Radio 5 Live report.
Very hard these days, but we got to move on.
Can you tell us a little about your nephew?
Sure. So Naftali was 16 years old. He just finished his 11th grade. I was in the midst of the matriculation exams. A redhead, funny guy, somewhat rebellious, a very talented musician, and just a vibrant young boy, young teenager, I should probably say.
How do you respond to the killing of Mohammed Abu Qadir, also a teenager?
It's extremely tragic. I don't think that there's any difference between Arab blood or Jewish blood. A murder is a murder, regardless, and there's nothing that can justify murder. And my heart goes out. We've just undergone this in our family. My heart and my family's heart goes out to the family of this, young boy. I very much hope that whoever did this will be brought to justice and dealt with the full severity. And, it is important for me, in this moment of our tremendous pain as a family, to call out, and say to everyone in this region, violence is not the path. Murder is murder, regardless of who does it or against whom it's directed. And, we want to call for rationalization and letting the bodies who need to deal with it bring the evil people to justice.
Friends, the uncle's words are very calming, very good words. He's the uncle of one of the 3 Israeli teenagers who was kidnapped and killed. His words are well said, and his summary or conclusion that murder is murder, and it needs to be investigated no matter who's killed or on whose side they are. That's very calming words from the uncle, one of the relatives of one of the 3 Israeli teenagers who were kidnapped and killed. The situation that this has caused in Israel now is really stressing tensions. There have been more clashes between the Israeli security forces and Palestinians following the kidnap and murder of a Palestinian teenager in a suspected revenge attack for the killing of 3 young Israelis. The funeral of the Palestinian teenager has been delayed so that a post-mortem examination can be completed. On the one border of the country, 10 Palestinians were injured. Well, I say border of the country, but it's a border that's been given up, the border where Israel now to Gaza. 10 Palestinians were injured when Israel carried out airstrikes on Gaza early this morning in response to mortar and rocket fire from Palestinian militants. Yolande Nell reports from Jerusalem.
The smouldering aftermath of overnight clashes. Palestinians in East Jerusalem vented their anger over the death of a local boy. Stones were their ammunition against Israeli police. The body of Mohammed Abu Khader, who was 17, was found in a forest yesterday, just hours after he was seen being bundled into a van. Israeli police say they're still investigating, but his family believe he was abducted and killed in revenge for the recent murder of 3 Israeli teenagers. The funeral can't take place until an autopsy's done.
He was stabbed multiple times and burnt. We weren't allowed to see the body. They had to use DNA tests to identify my son.
Now mourners wait for the funeral outside the family home. Everywhere you look here, you've got plenty of evidence of the overnight violence. But it reached much further than East Jerusalem. There were also clashes in Palestinian cities across the West Bank, where the Israeli army's been doing raids, and in the Gaza Strip. Explosions lit up the night sky in Gaza. This was Israel's response to the rockets fired by militants. In southern Israel, homes were hit. No one here was injured.
It's impossible to start the day without fear. And the children, even though I tell them not to be afraid, when it reaches you, it changes everything, the whole situation.
The cycle of violence is a familiar pattern in this decades-old conflict. But the latest developments are a worrying sign of a potential escalation.
Friends, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called the Palestinian teenager's death despicable and called for calm. Christian Fraser has this report from East Jerusalem.
Jerusalem forest, where Israeli police recovered this morning the remains of a body, a young man who'd been beaten and set alight.
Friends, let me point out, I'm playing you a story from yesterday. So when they say found this morning, it means yesterday morning. I'm playing this story because there's an interview in this with the mother of the Palestinian teenager who was found dead in the forest. And I think this is good to be aware of.
He was Mohammed Abu Khader.
And friends, I don't know why the video just stopped. Let's see if we can get it rolling again.
Yeah.
I tell you what we're going to do. Let me come out for just a moment, and I'm going to cycle this video and see if by doing that it'll play from the beginning without hanging up on us. Uh-oh. I think I may have just crashed our video player. Friends, while I'm trying to reload that, and I may have to go through, Windows this computer's on Windows 7, and it just did something that made the computer reboot itself just before broadcast time, and now it's freezing up. So, it may make me reboot it again. Ah, voila, thank you. It looks like we're okay. We can start this from the beginning again.
Jerusalem forest, where Israeli police recovered this morning the remains of a body, a young man who'd been beaten and set alight. He was Mohammed Abu Khader, a 17-year-old Palestinian schoolboy that neighbours say was kidnapped by Israeli settlers. His home is in East Jerusalem, and it now marks a makeshift front line in the running battles with Israeli soldiers. Inside the house, the grieving relatives. Among them, Mohammed's mother Suha, who had the grim task of identifying her son in a police morgue.
They told me someone was kidnapped on the way to the mosque. I called his phone. I kept calling and calling. It was switched off. My son wasn't answering.
The confrontations with soldiers are an everyday part of life in the Palestinian territories. They've seen it many times before. But there's nothing normal in this. Young men risking lives throwing stones in the direction of snipers.
It's bad. Our situation is very bad. It's very bad. All of these guys, they are relatives, and they are boiling.
The patience is wearing thin on all sides. Suddenly the house becomes the focus of a sustained Israeli assault. Stun grenades, rubber bullets, pandemonium. The relatives of the murdered boy take shelter. There's not even time to grieve. This is the cycle of violence, that eye for an eye mentality that in this region can quickly spiral out of control. The Palestinian anger is underpinned by the feeling on their side that their lives are worth less. So it's incumbent on the Israeli authorities that they condemn and pursue the perpetrator of this crime as they would had it been an Israeli child. Of course, earlier in the week, it was an Israeli child. 3 of them, abducted and murdered, say Israel, by Hamas. But this cabinet minister told me he considers today's murder every bit as abhorrent.
It shames our country, and if it is proven to be Israelis who are responsible, then I would consider it a terrorist attack.
A resumption of the peace talks, then, looks as distant as ever. There are 10 standoffs continuing in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank. Mortars were fired today from the Gaza Strip. Tomorrow, it's the funeral. Christian Fraser, BBC News, East Jerusalem.
So, friends, tensions high in the Middle East. They're in Israel and in Iraq. Iraqis from areas seized by forces led by the Islamist extremist group ISIS, or ISIL, have been telling harrowing stories about people being targeted by the fighters and killed. ISIS is now in control in Tikrit, Mosul, and Tel Afar. Around 50,000 people have fled those areas for the town of Sinjar near Syria's border. BBC correspondent Quentin Somerville traveled through Iraq's desert borderlands to reach them.
Every corner of the town of Sinjar is taken. Here, even building sites have become home to Iraqis fleeing ISIS. In the city's schools, the only private moments are found inside shelters made from desks and chairs. There are 6 families to a classroom. These Shia walked 20 miles to escape ISIS. Mustafa told me they're targeting Sunnis, Shias, even Kurds. They're targeting everyone. They have no humanity. They had to abandon homes in Mosul and Tal Afar, but even the children are trying to make the best of it. But they live in fear. This woman said, "I have 5 martyrs in my family, all killed by ISIS. My daughter is a widow. I have only 2 children left." Near the border with Syria, aid agencies have struggled to get here. ISIS have planted roadside bombs. Just up from Sinjar, the front line is on the town's doorstep. Tens of thousands of Shia Muslims, Christians, Kurds and others escaped along this road from Tal Afar, with ISIS to the east and to the west. Here in Sinjar they found sanctuary, and they say they need it
because ISIS is engaged in a campaign to systematically clear the towns and villages they left behind.
Hassan, a Kurd, was kidnapped by ISIS and held for 16 days. He was let go, but others weren't. The jihadists, he told me, were selective in their punishment.
They treated Sunnis better than others because they are also Sunni. They released them straight away, even paid their taxi fare home. But for Shia, if they cannot be exchanged for prisoners, they will simply cut off their heads.
We have been told that where ISIS take control, they've been methodical in hunting down non-Sunnis and those opposed to them.
ISIS is collecting information about people and compiling a database in order to identify those who work for the government or security forces. If they do not repent and pledge their allegiance to the caliphate, they will be killed. A lot of these people have disappeared in Mosul.
ISIS have already altered Iraq's borders. Through fear and force, they're transforming the ethnic and religious landscape around Sinjar, leaving many here wondering if they will ever be able to return home. Quentin Somerville, BBC News, on the Iraq-Syria border.
Friends, there are at least three things I'll mention to you in a moment here. A network of safe houses, precisely designed attack plans, and a strategy for an attack on Baghdad. Shows they were carefully prepared by ISIS long before their attacks in Iraq. ISIS, which has now declared an Islamic state in areas it has seized, appeared not just suddenly but well-armed and well-organized. The rapid and brutal advances of Sunni insurgents took the floundering Iraqi government by surprise when they started their campaign. For BBC Newsnight, Gabriel Gatehouse reports from Baghdad and hears from a former jihadist who advises the Iraqi government.
In Baghdad, they're waiting for what they call 0 hour, when ISIS sleeper cells will try to take control of the city. The group's leader is known as the Invisible Sheikh. Only 2 confirmed photographs of him exist. We've spoken to a man who says he knew Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi when they were both young religious scholars in the 1990s.
شخص كان قادم من مناطق فلاحة من سامراء من عائلة فقيرة لم تظهر عليه أي علامات الكاريزما أو القبول أو الجذب. انتقال الخاطئ للقوات الأمريكية ووضعه في سجن بوكا، الأمر الذي جعل يحتك مع أناس منظرين وكتاب وناشرين ودعاة من تنظيم ما يعرف آنذاك بتنظيم التوحيد والجهاد، فاستقبل منهم الفكرة فضلا على ما فيه من حماسة وما فيه من الشعور بالظلم والتذمر. كل هذه الأمور اجتمعت في السجن، فانساق معهم وانضم إليهم حال خروجه بعد 6 أشهر.
ISIS has enjoyed a spectacular and rapid rise to dominance. As it swept through the city of Mosul last month, the army simply melted away. Just days before they were driven out of the city, Iraqi security forces unearthed some crucial information. During a raid on a safe house, they seized a number of computer memory sticks containing a treasure trove of information on the group's organization and assets. Hisham al-Hashimi has been studying the data, a meticulous inventory of weapons, finances and fighters.
هذه اللستة أو هذا البريد الذي يخص المضافات هو كان يخص 6 أشهر فقط. 6 أشهر 191 شخص قدموا من أوروبا وشمال أفريقيا والخليج العربي وجمهوريات روسيا.
You've seen the contents of these memory sticks. What was the most valuable information?
هؤلاء سجلهم أو ذاكرتهم أو البريد الخاص بهم اعتنوا به عناية فائقة. أولا يذكرون اسمه الكامل الصحيح. ثانيا يذكر بالمقابل اسمه الوهمي. يذكر معه رقم جوازه والبلد التي جاء منها. يذكر معه من جنده في تلك البلد، يسمى التزكية. يذكر معه صورة من جوازه، يذكر معه رقم هاتفه البديل، ويذكر معه إيميل، حتى إذا قتل يخبر صاحب الإيميل أن فلان قتل. هذه الطريقة بهذه الدقة قليلة جدا في بريدهم السابق. هذا يعني أنهم أصبح لديهم تطور. قديما كان يأتي يمزق جوازه ويدخل بالمضافة ثم ينتظر ماذا تأمر الإمارة بخصوصه. هذا التنظيم يدل على أنهم لديهم شبكة تجنيد واسعة في أوروبا وفي شمال أفريقيا وفي بعض مناطق الخليج العربي واليمن.
Al-Baghdadi now has his sights set on the capital. Al-Hashimi estimates that ISIS has put in place hundreds of sleeper cells in a belt around Baghdad, with more inside the city itself. They're waiting for a sign, he says, 0 hour.
هذه المجاميع وظيفتها إسقاط الثكنات العسكرية ومهاجمة المراكز الأمنية والاستيلاء على أسلحتها وعجلاتها. حينما تسقط الثكنات العسكرية والمراكز الأمنية في تلك المناطق تكون هي ساعة الصفر، فتستيقظ الخلايا النائمة في تلك المناطق وتستولي على إدارة الأمن والإدارة المحلية في تلك المنطقة.
Just like they did in Mosul.
هذا الذي حصل في الموصل.
With revenue streams from smuggled antiquities to gun running to captured oil wells, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi no longer has to rely on foreign money. ISIS is morphing from an insurgent group into a conventional army.
هزيمتهم بمعنى إلى النهاية هذا غير ممكن، لكن ممكن إضعافهم. يكون إضعافهم بالنسبة للعراق وبالنسبة لسوريا هو بإرضاء سنة العراق، باستعمال الفصائل السلفية والإخوانية، الفصائل الجهادية، قوات نخبة متخصصة، غطاء جوي، وحدة متخصصة لقتل البغدادي. هذه المجموعة، هذه المعادلة مشتركة تستطيع إضعاف دولة البغدادي. أما أي شيء غير هذا فما ممكن إلا أن تكون دولة البغدادي هي التي تتقدم يوما بعد يوم.
Friends, next we turn to some news from the United States. But before I read the headline, the introduction to that story for you, I want to draw our attention to Leviticus 26. There's a parallel chapter to this in Deuteronomy 28. Both of those are known among some people who studied God's Word. They know these two chapters to represent the blessings and cursings chapter, because in each of those chapters it starts out with the blessings that God promises to individuals and to a nation. I was trying to find the word to say individuals by themselves as individuals and collectively as a nation. I guess you see it in some contracts when they say jointly and severally. You know, jointly meaning collectively as a nation, severally meaning to each person as an individual also. But because some of these things relate to a group of people as a nation as a whole, that's why I say collectively as a nation is mainly what it's addressing, but also to each individual. And God starts out by saying that if you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments, I'll give you rain in due season. Now that can apply to a person individually. He can give you rain and your neighbor over there, the sun's just beating down on his land and he's not getting a drop of all that rain that God has falling on your land. But he can also do that to whole groups of areas and to the whole nation. And your trees shall yield their fruit. You got fruit trees, God's going to make sure they grow lots of fruit. He's going to bless your agriculture if you're obeying him. And I'll give you peace in the land. You know, you'll lie down and none shall make you afraid. There's more in here. He goes on, though, after a certain point of mentioning blessing after blessing, including the one that says, and you shall chase your enemies, and they shall fall before you by the sword, and 5 of you shall chase 100. And then if you multiply it out, 20 times 5 is 100. 100 of you would be, say, 20 times 100. That'd be 2,000. But God magnifies it. He doesn't leave it at 5 of you will chase 100 and then just multiply it out to see what you get next. He says, no, 100 of you will put 10,000 to flight when you're obeying your Creator and you're under His blessings, His protection, His very special favor, because you are obeying Him. Now you say, oh, well, God's playing favorites. Friends, these blessings and cursings apply to everyone. And everyone who's obeying God can receive these blessings that God promises. But only if you're obeying Him. Now, if you're obeying Him, you're obeying that command that says, thou shalt not murder. And so you won't be murdering your neighbor. And your neighbor won't be murdering you. And if your neighbor is trying to murder you, but you are obeying God, God says 5 of you will put 100 of your enemy to flight. 100 of you will put 10,000s to flight. That's verse 8 of Leviticus 26. But he goes on then and says, beginning in verse 14, but if you hearken not unto me, and will not do all these commandments, then just the reverse of all these wonderful blessings that God has announced. And he says in verse 17, and I'll set my face against you. If you're not obeying God, these are the cursings now, if you don't obey God. I'll set my face against you, and you shall be slain before your enemies. That they that hate you shall reign over you, and you shall flee when none pursues. And he goes on, verse 19, it says, I'll break the pride of your power. But I mention that because in this next story, you're going to hear about security measures being tightened up for flights that are destined for the United States. And this is to happen around the world. David Eads and Frank Gardner explain what's behind the move.
Right now, security is being tightened for airline passengers who want to head to the United States. It's in response to warnings of what they're calling a credible threat. The measures, which have not been disclosed, in fact, will affect passengers taking direct flights to the US. It all comes amid fears that a new bomb could be developed by Al-Qaeda, which could evade current security checks. Passengers are being warned that airport queues could be longer as a result of these new measures. I've been speaking to our security correspondent Frank Gardner about the evidence behind this move.
What's behind this is the fear that Al-Qaeda's bomb-making expertise has proliferated out of Yemen to Syria, where there are European passport holders amongst the jihadists there who are fighting with ISIS, but more specifically with Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the Al-Qaeda-affiliated group. For the last 5 years, Al-Qaeda in Yemen have had somebody called Ibrahim al-Asiri, who is a Saudi national, who is an expert bomb maker, and he has been working on devices that 3 times he's been able to get these past airport security and on international flights. In 2009, he put one on his brother, and it blew his brother up, trying to assassinate the man who's now Minister of Interior in Saudi, the Prince. It didn't kill the Prince, but it killed his brother. And then there were the printer ink-tone cartridges, and of course there was the Detroit Pants bomber in Christmas '09. And there was another device, an upgraded device in May 12, just before the London Olympics, which was the person who volunteered to do it, turned out to be a double agent, and handed the device to the Saudis, who gave it to the FBI. The fear now is that rather than being hemmed into Yemen and sending out these devices, they've now trained up a new generation who are in Syria and able to pass freely across the Turkish border and back into Europe.
You have been watching Nightcast with Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth. Nightcast can be seen Sunday through Thursday nights here on cogtv.org. Tonight's program is also available anytime on demand in the cogtv.org video archive.